The coffee shop hummed with the sound of clinking cups and the soft murmur of conversations. It was a typical afternoon in the busy city, with people gathered in their usual spots, sipping their favorite drinks, lost in their own worlds. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint chatter of friends catching up and the soft rustle of paper as people worked on their laptops. The atmosphere felt warm, almost comforting, as sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting gentle patterns on the polished wooden floors. In the corner of the room, near the counter, an entitled woman sat, her attention fixed entirely on her phone. Her long manicured nails tapped absent-mindedly across the screen as she scrolled through social media, her expression a mixture of impatience and indifference. She didn't seem to notice the bustle around her. Her mind was elsewhere, likely focused on her next big plan, or the latest trend that had caught her attention. She didn't care about the lives of the people around her, and certainly didn't notice the soldier who had just walked in. The soldier's boots made a quiet sound as they met the tiled floor, the only noticeable noise in the otherwise calm space. He was a tall man, his military uniform slightly worn from travel. His face was tired, with a hint of exhaustion in his eyes, the kind that only comes from being away for too long. He paused for a moment by the door, scanning the room, before heading to the counter to order his coffee. Despite the fatigue, there was a quiet strength in his posture, a sense of purpose in his every step. The soldier stood in line, his hands loosely gripping the edge of the counter. His uniform, though pressed, showed signs of wear, a few creases from the long journey, a patch slightly askew. He was quiet, his mind elsewhere, still adjusting to the peace of being back home. The weight of the deployment, the long months away from family and friends, lingered in his eyes, but there was a quiet pride in the way he stood, a dignity that couldn't be stripped away by the fatigue of travel. As he waited for his turn, his gaze drifted around the room. He noticed a few people nodding off over their laptops, others buried in their phones. It was just another ordinary day in the coffee shop, a place where people gathered to escape their routines, even for a short while. But then, his presence caught the attention of the woman sitting near the counter. She was tapping her phone, clearly oblivious to the world around her, when her eyes landed on the soldier. She studied him for a moment, her expression turning into something that could only be described as disdain. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face as she set her phone down with a sharp movement. "Well, look at that," she muttered loud enough for those nearby to hear. Her voice dripped with sarcasm. "A soldier, huh? Here in my coffee shop, wearing that uniform. What, you think you're special or something? Just out here trying to get attention?" The soldier remained still, focusing on the counter, avoiding her gaze. He felt the weight of her words, but didn't let them land. He knew better than to engage in the type of argument she seemed ready to start, but she didn't stop. Her voice grew louder, enough to turn the heads of a few other customers. "I just don't get it," she continued, her tone sharp. "Why don't you go do something useful instead of walking around in your little costume like you're some kind of hero? You think wearing that makes you important? It's just a uniform." Her words stung, but the soldier stayed silent. He kept his eyes on the counter, his jaw tightening, trying to block out the sound of her taunts. The room was starting to feel smaller, the quiet hum of conversation, replaced by the tension hanging in the air. The other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pretending not to notice, while others glanced at the soldier, unsure whether to step in or let him handle it. The woman's voice rose even higher, growing more venomous with each word. "You think you're doing something noble, don't you?" she sneered, her eyes narrowing as she glared at the soldier. "All you're doing is wasting taxpayer money? Do you have any idea how much your little war games cost? While people like me work hard to make a living, people like you are off causing unnecessary wars for what? Power? Greed? You're a disgrace, you know that?" Her words echoed through the coffee shop, cutting through the air like a blade. The soldier's face remained unreadable, but there was a slight twitch in his jaw as he fought to keep his composure. He could feel the eyes of the room turning toward them, some with discomfort, others with curiosity. He wanted to turn around and walk away to escape the confrontation, but he stood there, forcing himself to remain in place. He had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the best response to such hatred. But the woman wasn't finished. Seeing him stand there not reacting only seemed to fuel her fury. She crossed her arms, leaning forward with an air of superiority. "What are you going to do now, huh?" she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "Just stand there and pretend like you're some kind of hero? You're nothing but a pawn in a broken system. And you," she pointed at him, her finger trembling with anger, "you're part of the problem." The room felt smaller now, the energy thickening as the tension stretched further. A few people shifted in their seats, glancing nervously at one another, unsure whether to speak up or stay out of it. Some had already begun to avert their eyes, uncomfortable with the confrontation, as if pretending it wasn't happening could make it go away. Others, however, looked on intently, some starting to silently side with the soldier, recognizing the unfairness of the woman's accusations. A man in the corner of the room cleared his throat, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. He had been trying to focus on his work, but the growing conflict was impossible to ignore. He looked up, briefly meeting the soldier's eyes, then back at the woman. He didn't speak, but his frown deepened, a subtle gesture of support for the soldier. On the other side of the room, a young woman glanced back and forth between the two, her discomfort evident. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her hands wrapped around her cup, but she stayed silent, torn between wanting to say something and not knowing what to say. She couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the soldier, even though she wasn't sure what had sparked the argument in the first place. As the soldier stood there hearing the woman's words grow more pointed and harsh, he felt the weight of their stares. The longer he said nothing, the more people around him seemed to grow restless, caught between wanting to support him and not knowing how to do so without making the situation worse. The room, once a peaceful refuge from the outside world, now buzzed with uncertainty, as if everyone was unsure whether to intervene or let the soldier defend himself. But the soldier, calm and composed, remained still, focusing only on the woman. He knew if he spoke, things would only escalate. He wasn't going to let her drag him into an argument, but the silence between them was becoming increasingly unbearable. The woman's voice grew louder, her words sharper as she shifted from accusations to personal attacks. "You probably don't even understand what you're fighting for. People like you just follow orders without thinking about the consequences," she scoffed, looking the soldier up and down with disdain. "What makes you so special, huh? You think you're above the rest of us just because you wore that uniform? You're no hero, you're just part of a broken system." For a moment, it seemed as though the soldier might remain silent, just as he had been doing for the past few minutes. But then, with a slow breath, he turned slightly toward her. The calmness in his posture didn't waver, but something in his eyes shifted. There was a quiet strength there, a quiet dignity that made the room fall still. The woman was caught off guard when he finally spoke, his voice steady and calm. "You're right about one thing," he began, his words deliberate, but with an undeniable strength behind them. "I'm not a hero. I'm just a soldier, but what you don't understand is that every person who serves does so for a reason, often a very personal one." He paused, his eyes scanning the room briefly, catching the attention of the customers who had been watching, waiting for something to happen. The tension in the air seemed to grow heavier, but the soldier pressed on, his voice unwavering. "I didn't join the military because I thought I was special," he continued. "I joined because I believe in something bigger than myself. I joined to protect the people I love, the country I call home, and even the ones who might not understand the sacrifices that we make." His words were slow and measured, but there was an unmistakable pride in the way he spoke. "I've been to places you'll never see, seen things you can't imagine, and done things that still weigh heavily on my heart. But every time I put this uniform on, it's because I've chosen to do my part. And yes, that means sacrifices. It means missing birthdays, holidays, moments that I'll never get back. But it's something I willingly accept because someone has to do it." He looked directly at the woman, his gaze unwavering. "You have every right to express your opinion, but you do not have the right to disrespect me or anyone who wears this uniform. We do our jobs to ensure that people like you can sit here in comfort, expressing whatever opinions you choose without fear. So, before you continue to judge me, or anyone like me, I suggest you think about what it takes to protect the freedoms you enjoy every day." The room, which had been divided moments before, fell into a heavy silence. No one dared to speak. The hum of the coffee shop, the usual noise of cups being set down, and the sound of the espresso machine steaming milk, seemed to disappear. All that remained was the weight of the soldier's words hanging in the air. Even the woman seemed to shrink back, her anger slowly fading as she absorbed the impact of what he had said. The others in the coffee shop, who had previously been uncertain or unwilling to get involved, now sat in stillness, their eyes fixed on the soldier. It wasn't just his words, but the way he said them, calm, composed, and with such quiet power, that had captured everyone's attention. The soldier didn't look for applause or praise. He simply turned back toward the counter to grab his coffee, leaving the room in stunned silence. The woman sat there, stunned by the soldier's words. Her mouth opened and closed, as if trying to find something to say, but for the first time her voice faltered. She had been so sure of herself before, so convinced that her opinions were right, but now she seemed lost. Her gaze shifted to the floor, then back to the soldier, and a small, forced laugh escaped her lips. I didn't mean it like that," she stammered, her voice softer now, but lacking any real conviction. "I didn't know you were, really serving. I just thought." She trailed off, her words failing her. The soldier, his face still calm, didn't acknowledge her apology. He simply reached for his coffee, his fingers brushing against the warm cup as he took it from the counter. His silence spoke volumes, more powerful than any words could be. Without a glance back, he turned to leave the coffee shop, the door's soft jingle marking his exit. The woman's voice rose again, half-heartedly calling after him, but he didn't stop. He stepped out into the cool air, leaving the tense room behind. Just as the door closed behind him, the quiet murmur of the coffee shop was interrupted by a voice. A deep, steady voice that had been silent throughout the entire ordeal. A man, who had been sitting in the back corner, looked up from his seat. He was older, with the kind of rugged features that spoke of time spent in places far removed from the comforts of a coffee shop. "I've got something to say," he said, his tone firm and clear. The room fell silent again as everyone turned toward him. "I served too, 30 years, and I'll tell you this, what that young man said back there? It's the truth. Every soldier, every veteran, makes sacrifices, and no one has the right to belittle that." The man's words hit the room like a shockwave. The woman sat frozen, unable to respond. The twist of the moment was undeniable. What had begun as an argument against the soldier's service had now been turned on its head, as another voice of experience and truth stood up to validate what had just been said. The room, once divided, now seemed to rally behind the veteran's quiet authority. The woman sat back in her seat, her face flushed with embarrassment. The force of her earlier words seemed to drain from her, leaving her suddenly small, as if she had realized just how wrong she had been. The pride that had fueled her accusations moments before now seemed misplaced, and her gaze dropped to her hands, wringing together in awkward silence. She had misjudged him, misjudged all of them, and the weight of that realization settled heavily on her shoulders. Across the room, the other customers who had been watching the scene unfold began to approach the soldier, one by one. They nodded, offering quiet words of thanks for his service. Some extended their hands in greeting, others simply gave him a respectful smile. The room, once tense and divided, now hummed with a sense of gratitude and understanding. The soldier, with his calm demeanor, accepted their gestures without fanfare. He wasn't seeking praise, only acknowledgement for what he had done, not just for himself, but for everyone. Meanwhile, the woman, who had once stood so confidently, throwing out harsh words with little thought for their impact, remained in the corner of the room. Her shoulders slumped, and her eyes were firmly fixed on the floor, as though the weight of her own words had finally sunk in. The fierce energy she had once carried was now replaced by a hollow quiet. Her posture, once proud and unbending, now appeared small, fragile even. She didn't dare to look up, knowing that the silence around her was louder than anything she could say. She had tried to tear the soldier down to make him seem small, but now she was the one who felt exposed, standing alone with her own mistakes. No one approached her. Not a single person from the room offered even a passing glance. The others, once divided in their uncertainty, had now come together in their quiet support of the soldier, their respect for him unspoken but shared. The woman, now fully aware of her misjudgment, remained isolated in the corner, her earlier bravado stripped away. The shame of being so wrong, of so loudly assuming she understood something she hadn't, felt heavier than any argument she could have won. She wasn't the hero of this moment. She had misread the whole scene. Her own actions had unwittingly shown her as someone who didn't see the bigger picture, someone who hadn't considered the cost of the things she was so quick to judge. As the coffee shop returned to a sense of normalcy, the clinking of cups and the low hum of quiet conversation slowly resumed. The tension in the air that had once been thick was now gone, replaced by a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a mix of respect and reflection. The narrator, watching from a distance, couldn't help but reflect on what had just transpired. It was so easy, so quick, to judge someone, to assume that the person in front of you is exactly what they appear on the surface. And yet, how often do we forget that everyone carries a burden, something invisible to the eye? The soldier hadn't asked for validation, hadn't demanded applause, but his simple, composed response had exposed something in all of them. Behind every face there's a story, an experience, a sacrifice that isn't always visible at first glance. In moments like these, when the world seems to pause and everyone feels the weight of an unspoken truth, it's clear that judgment is a fleeting thing. People aren't just their actions or the roles they play in society. They're more than that. And sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is listen to the quiet, to allow silence to fill the spaces between words. It's in that silence that the real truths are spoken, truths that don't need to be shouted, but felt. If you enjoyed this story and the powerful message it shared, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to drop a comment below. Your perspective matters. And if you want to see more content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Share this story with your friends to spread the message of respect and understanding. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.